We owe a debt of gratitude to the Brunswick Topsom Land Trust, the Conservation Commission of the town of Brunswick, and Manomet Conservation Sciences. If you don't know these organizations, well, you ought to. They're lovely and they really impact our town and our region. And we are so thankful for the volunteers who have come to speak to us tonight out of the goodness of their hearts. So thank you all so much for attending. We could not do these programs without you. And thank you, volunteers, for educating us tonight. So the one last thing I will say is that we do have more of these each month, so please just keep an ear out for more. And if you see anything tonight where you're like, uh-oh, how do I get rid of that? They didn't give me, they told me how, but like, that's a lot of shovels or something I need, or maybe I need some work gloves, or maybe, remember, all of the tools they mentioned, you can borrow them from the library. So we have something called the Root Slayer, which I can tell you has taken out lots of invasives. I've heard the stories. And but we have things you can smother invasives with. We've got sifters for other things. You need a tool, you come talk to us. We'll probably have it or we'll get it for you. So with that, Steve, you're up. Oh, you have a pointer if you want it.
Oh, I love pointers. Thank you. I could use all the pointers I can get. Thank you, Hazel. You're always so entertaining. And, hopefully I will be. I'm the executive director, Steve Walker, of Brunswick Topsom Land Trust. I tried to get our stewardship director to do this presentation because she's much more attuned and well-versed in invasive management. So I put together a presentation that was interesting to me. If you don't get out of it what you thought you were going to, I'm happy to do question and answers afterwards because I've, in a previous life, done a lot more hands-on invasive treatment than I do these days. But, you know, if you're a fan of Jurassic Park, I'm a fan of Jeff Goldblum. But, you know, this sort of sums up invasives. Life is always going to find a way. If you give it an opportunity. And, you know, I sort of want to start my presentation with a little ecology background of how invasive get invasives, what's invasive. Anyway, bear with me. So there's an ecological principle, R selected species and K selected species, different lifestyles. Or selected species, as you can see here, the red line that goes woo, 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 woo all over the place. They exceed carrying capacity, they crash, they throw out a lot of genetic material into the landscape, reproduce really fast. Their strategy is just to get a lot of their members of their species out there, regardless of predation, just to sort of flood the market. K-selected species, a little more investment in raising offspring, a little more investment in longevity. And you can see here, they both eventually arrive at carrying capacity, which is the natural ability of the environment to support a certain number of population of species. With invasives, basically that carrying capacity gets taken out. There is more or less a free-for-all. And you get, just regardless of whether they're naturally an R-selected species or a K-selected species, they get a foothold and they just romp through the landscape. And a couple examples of how both R and K species can become invasive. What was his name? The former drug dealer president of Colombia. He decided he was going to bring in hippos to Colombia, and they ended up becoming invasive. There's still a big problem. You know, you have hippos. You don't imagine that becoming an invasive species, but it does. In the right environment, in the right setting, you know, African animal in South America, they love the big wetlands. They ate all the vegetation, displaced a lot of critters. Invasive. And then on the other scale, an R-selected species, of course, this is zoom in of hemlock woolly adelgid, so you can actually see what the critter looks like. Very tiny, explosive population, obviously invasive here. So both R and K can become invasive, and of course plants over millions of years of evolution, and this goes for animals too, have adapted every tool possible to be successful in terms of breeding. I mean, here are just examples of plant seeds. They stick to critters, they blow in the air, they last forever in the soil horizon until they have a chance to germinate. So nature is great at providing adaptation through evolution. So strategy is certainly no problem. And then dispersal and establishment techniques, and this is sort of goes to the heart of how invasives become invasives. Getting from one part of the landscape where they're native, where carrying capacity actually means something, to then coming to a different landscape or a different setting where it's a free-for-all. And this can be, as you can see here, anything from floating across the ocean in rafts to storms carrying seeds over. These are natural dispersals. Where the real invasive problem starts is where you have a species like humans, the ultimate invasive, facilitating this dispersal, whether it's shipping traffic from Asia, whether it's settlers coming over and intentionally planting things, you name it. That's sort of when invasives, I mean, for years of evolution, dispersals happen, plants have moved, animals have moved across the landscape, but until this sort of heightened human facilitated movement is when we really started seeing things get mixed up. All right, so man, these are really blurry, aren't they? They're not me. I apologize for that, but I can walk you through them. How plant succession works and how natural communities are formed, I think, is important to understanding why invasives are a concern. Think retreated ice age, barren landscape here in Maine. Through time, organic material, of course, collected on the rocks and exposed underlying material that the ice scraped away. You get soil buildup, you get plants that have evolved with the landscape, with the climate, with the current conditions over time. And over hundreds of years, you reach what's called climax. Or in the state of Maine, we have 86, I want to say, natural community types, which are those climax. If you leave nature alone, this is what it's going to look like with natural disturbances or without natural disturbances. Locally, one of those communities, probably the most common in Brunswick right here, is our red oak white pine forest. You go to town commons, this is the dominant forest type. If you were to leave the landscape alone without, take natural disturbances out of the equation, natural disturbances, it would be largely red oak white pine forest, where you got the hydrology, where the plants have their feet wet, typically red maple swamps. With some natural disturbances, of course, we've got a variety of natural community types here in Brunswick. Fire, we got our sandplain grasslands and pitch pine heath barrens. Again, natural result of succession with fire in place. And of course, disturbance with tides and storm surge. You get climax communities like salt marsh, very different from red oak, white pine, but without disturbance, without invasives, these are the natural settings. With artificial disturbance, say human facilitated disturbance, you get sort of the same progression of plant types, just on a much faster scale than the evolutionary history of natural communities. You bulldoze a chunk of ground, the pioneering plant species move in. Over time, shrubs start getting a foothold, shade out those pioneering herbaceous plants. Eventually, forests regenerate. It's great. We're a forested state. You cut the forest, it grows back over time here in Maine. Where the problem occurs is, whoops, this was supposed to have a bulldozer on it, so ignore the fire. But where the problem occurs is when you introduce these alien species and you have a disturbance. The same little bulldozer that was supposed to be here clears the land. it gives much greater potential for these non-native aggressive species that don't have that carrying capacity ceiling on them to take over. So your loosestrife, your Phragmites, your you name it, I'll show you some species later on, will jump in, and that can happen at every single successional state right up to your forest. There's invasive trees like Norway maple here in Brunswick. And because these can outcompete the natural ones, your communities, your natural communities really shift when they're present. And then add climate change. There's my bulldozer back. You add climate change to this mix, and not only are we seeing more and more alien non-native species coming in, but they're becoming much more successful because they have a whole different climate to work with. At the same time, and this is where the two sort of processes hit head on, at the same time our native plants are being more and more stressed with changes in hydrology, changes in temperature, changes in nutrient availability. So you got climate change impacting our native species, invasives coming in, and it's like a head-on collision. As an ecologist, you really start to worry. We have done, just sticking on the climate change theme here, if you're interested in the vulnerability of plants and animals with climate, this is getting off topic, but it's interesting and fun. I would certainly encourage you to look up a Manomet-sponsored report. Manomet's in the room tonight. I had the pleasure of working on this when I was at Fish and Wildlife, where we looked through hundreds of species of plants and animals and looked at their vulnerability to climate change-induced stressors, one of those being the rise of invasive species. Not going to go into it in depth, but look it up on the web. It's a really good read. All right. So with that background, let's talk about some of the history of alien invasions here. You can read these, but I'll go through them anyway because they're fun. Going back to 1565, that's the first records of European introductions to New England. 1631, intentional introductions of ornamental plants for gardens was the first documentation. And by 1672, there's actually lists of non-native weeds that had sprung up since the English planted and kept cattle in New England. Some of those intentional, a lot of them unintentional with cow manure or whatever, seeds and fur, you name it. By 1698, so this is long time ago, we were getting ornamental gardens established, botanical gardens, where we were intentionally bringing European flowering plants over because we liked the way they looked and we thought it would supplement, and boy has it, our native biota. First commercial nursery, 1737, 1747, first botanical garden. So you can see over time these intentional plantings, and then of course Thomas Jefferson, famous for in early 1800s introducing Scotch broom. Now look at it, it's invasive up and down the eastern seaboard as well as western United States. Victorian gardens, of course, real door opener for invasives, and of course the modern day big box stores. Still many areas in the country you could actually walk in and buy purple loosestrife to plant in your garden. Fortunately in Maine we have good regulations. Speaking of regulations, the Clinton administration back in 1999 sort of established the first federal approach to invasive species. And it had some good definitions that I wanted to share with you, just to clarify what's invasive, what's native that's maybe competitive. So they identify or define alien species as something that is not native to an ecosystem. That is logical and makes sense. Introduction of course, as a result of human activity. And then invasive species is pretty broad. It's economic or environmental harm or harm to human health is what would make a species under this executive order invasive. So being a birder, I'm using birds as an example tonight, hope people don't mind, but I wanted to highlight the sort of spectrum, if you will, of invasiveness. These should be four pretty familiar species with folks. Rock pigeon up in the upper left here. Non-native, alien, some economic harm in terms of disease spreading, certainly makes a mess of our cities, but hasn't really displaced natural flora and fauna. They're in their native habitat in Europe. They nest on sea cliffs. There's very little documentation of them using sea cliffs along the coast of Maine or Atlantic Canada, if you will. So they're not really displacing other species, but they are, effectively causing some economic harm and certainly disease spreaders. English sparrows, house sparrows, one of my least favorite birds on the planet. They will come in, they'll wipe out bluebirds, they'll wipe out entire swallow colonies, they will displace native fauna. Same with European starlings. Interesting fact there, they were brought over because somebody was a fan of Shakespeare and wanted every bird mentioned in Shakespearean literature in the United States. That's how we got starlings. Yay, hooray. Mute swans as well, evil, evil animals. You get them in aquatic systems in the U.S. They will totally outcompete native waterfowl. They'll munch aquatic plants right down to the roots and allow other invasive aquatic species to come in. So, these things all have invasive tendencies, but it's all sort of relative how invasive and what impact they have. Native birds, native to the U.S., can also be invasive. These are, primarily brown-headed cowbird, evolved with buffalo herds moving across the prairies as we started doing agriculture in the east and having, cow herds similar to buffalo herds. They could spread eastward and started to show invasive tendencies by displacing native forest songbirds. They're a parasite. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests and kick out the nestlings. House finches, very common feeder bird around here. That's a Western species that was brought over to New York City because people liked the song it had. It escaped or it was intentionally released so the folks didn't get arrested who brought it over. And now they spread conjunctivitis. They do have impacts to the native bird populations. But again, a native to the West Coast species can be invasive just as they come over to the other part of the country. And of course, Canada geese. There's a native population that's highly migratory, just as Canada geese should be. There's another population that loves our golf courses and our parks and can actually show invasive tendencies. So take-home message, invasive is certainly in the eye of the beholder, and it's across a wide spectrum. One thing, and I'm probably going to get enemies tonight here, this is probably the worst animal invasive species we have in this country. There's no excuse for letting your cats outside. They don't need to be outside. They do tremendous harm to not only birds, you can see here 1 billion birds a year, but also small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, you name it. So anyway, that probably made me enemies.
To clarify, Steve doesn't hate cats. Not indoor cats.
I used to have 6 indoor cats, 4 of which were outdoor cats that I influenced. I don't need to spend much time on this. $100 billion a year. That's what invasive species are estimated to cost our country. And that second line there, you look at our endangered species, and I've worked at IF&W, as I referenced earlier, and we have to do a state wildlife action plan update every 10 or so years. And This is true in Maine, that more than 50% of the native species that we have listed, invasions, different invasive species, are the underlying cause of those declines. It's like second to direct habitat loss. All right, so now probably getting back to what people wanted me to talk about tonight. Invasives in Brunswick Topsom area. I'll let the Conservation Commission really fill in the details, but when I moved in town, I've lived on Bowden Street for about 16 years. I was just blown away by how well established things like Norway maple are, burning bush, that bright red one. Of course, we've got honeysuckle, bittersweet, buckthorn. We've got all these shrubby plants around. At the Land Trust, when we take on a property, we certainly inventory what we have for invasives, and we treat where we feel we can get a foothold. There are many areas, however, where it's not worth the limited funding we have, and you're never going to get out ahead of it. So, like, for instance, a good example is the islands in Androscoggin. You land out there in the boat, you're greeted with a field of Japanese knotweed. You can spend a career trying to fight it back, but some of these battles we give up on. But where we feel there's just a little bit of barberry or a little bit of honeysuckle, and we can cut it, we use Roundup, I can never say the other word. We do chemical treatments because it's the most effective. We'd certainly take it on. So those were the shrubby species, common herbaceous plants in Brunswick. Of course, purple loosestrife, which I've talked about before. These things produce like tens of thousands of seeds each plant. Don't ever pull them, spray them with herbicide. You start pulling these things, any little piece of the root system will sprout again. The seed dispersal is incredible. Phragmites, if you see disturbed areas in our coastal salt marshes, you might see this coming in. Good examples are like the upper New Meadows, the lakes, which have been artificially impounded. That's changed the salinity and changed the hydrology, giving European Phragmites a foothold and an advantage. We've had, years back when I was at Maine Coast Heritage Trust, we went out and we tackled a patch of Phragmites on Harpswell Cove, and our approach was to bundle stems. You walk into a stand about this size, you bundle a dozen or so stems together, cut them, and then just treat the cut tops with herbicide, a direct drip, because you're in a salt marsh, you don't want to spray stuff, but it's drip by drip by drip by drip in each cut stem. It takes forever, but it's the most effective approach to Phragmites. Yellow iris down here on the bottom, we're starting to, when I was natural resource planner for the town of Brunswick 20 years ago now, we had just seen individual plants. Now it's up and down the Androscoggin. I think it's on every island I've been to in the river. It's above the dams, it's below the dams. It's one that's really taken off. And in fact, we started treating it around some of our island properties, and it's getting away from us, unfortunately. I added Himalayan balsam down here in the lower corner of that purple plant. That's something that's really hitting the eastern portions of the mid-coast up around Rockland, Thomaston area, and it's starting to creep down here. So if you start seeing that, what it is like a impatiens, a jewelweed on steroids. It's the same growth form, the same flower type, but once that gets established, it's the same thing. It's an annual, produces a lot of seeds, and it's one to look out for here locally. And of course, then there's insects. I'm not going to talk green crabs. There's folks from Manomet who know a lot more about that than I do. Woolly adelgid, I showed you the picture earlier. Here's what you typically see on hemlock branches. We did a biological control treatment using a Japanese beetle. These are native to Asia. We released these beetles. on a couple properties to see if we can establish a population for that sort of natural, it's a non-native predatory beetle we're using to take on a invasive species. We'll see how that goes. There's been some success with other land trusts. Emerald ash borer, unfortunately, hitting our ashes, even brown ash, which is so incredibly important to the Wabanaki Federation. It's a shame to see that happening. Brown-tail moths, I hope you all know about. We don't need to talk about them, they're hideous. And winter moths, which I think in the middle here, I just noticed this winter it seemed to be an unusual explosion of these guys around December, I think it was, when we had that warm sort of wet weather. You drive down the streets of Brunswick and it's like, what are all these moths? But that's one that's really come in recently, eating fruit trees. And you'll see, if you see a boring looking moth flying in the winter, that's those guys. All right. So tools to identify and manage, there's great resources out there. Certainly I'll prompt workshops we're doing. Our next one that's tomorrow, I believe, is full, but we have several hands-on workshops to identify and treat invasives at Brunswick Thompson Land Trust. There's guides like this Maine Invasive Plant Field Guide put out by Maine Natural Areas Program. IMAP Invasives, which well, here's the Maine Natural Areas Program website. I encourage you all, if you're interested in this topic, to go there. It's a great source. Has lists, has photos, has treatment ideas, you name it. Maine Natural Areas Program. This is IMAP Invasives. I zoomed in on Brunswick Thompson. This allows managers and citizen scientists alike to go out and map what they're seeing on the ground by species, and you can start to see what we're up against, what plants or invasive plants are in your area to become familiar with, and it's a great way to add data to the state coffers so we know just the extent of the issues. Workshops coming up. Like I said, the next one is full, but please look at our newsletter for when the next ones are. We're doing these through November with the help of Sarah Walpole here, a very well-known local landscape outfit. And that's all I have. I'm handing over to the Conservation Commission. We'll look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kurt Stinson from the Conservation Commission, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Conservation Commission has been doing to manage some habitat that is worth protecting. Start with Captain Fitzgerald Park. I don't know if a lot of people have been out there. If you're a birder like Steve, you've probably been out there. But Old Bath Road, across from Lowe's, go up that green stretch is Lindbergh Crossing. Terrific acquisition we got from the Navy. But there's a knotweed stand sort of a little off the end of the paved portion that the Conservation Commission has been tackling for probably about 8 years, give or take. You can see the darker portion on that map is the sandplain grassland boundary, so pretty much the entire park itself is sandplain grassland. It's an S1 critically imperiled habitat. Part of that is because it's so rare in the state. There's 5 or fewer occurrences. So this is worth trying to preserve as best we can. And the knotweed that you see here was from this spring's cut that we did. We try to get out in the spring to cut as much as we can. You have to bag it because if you leave the clippings, they'll regrow, regenerate. It's a little hard to see here, but that line of trees behind this particular knotweed stand is the extent of how big it was when we first started working on it. So we've got it down to a smaller patch now. We cut it close to the ground. We collect and bag all the cuttings. We filled about 19 bags or so the first time we did this. And this year, 2 bags, neither of them was completely full, so we're making some progress. We did have, probably 3 or 4 years in, the town did an herbicide treatment after they were cut, and that's helped as well. But since then, we haven't had to resort to that. We just keep going out there and cutting it. So the management plan for this parcel includes actively managing the sandplain grassland, besides just that knotweed patch. If it's not managed, the more aggressive species are going to come in and overrun the natural habitat. The best way to protect this is with a prescribed burn. There's one, there'll be some pictures later this spring, but there's a lot of coordination between different town and state agencies and nonprofits to do that. But that is the best way to manage this habitat. The pitch pines, which are common to this habitat, can survive the burns. On top of that, the town bush hogs about 1/3 of the park parcel each year. The prescribed burns are great, but it's a lot of effort and a lot of coordination, and you have to have exact weather conditions to do that. So instead of that, that gets bush hogged. And there was one logging effort to remove some of the species that are not part of the sandplain grassland that was done 3 or 4 years ago. This is not necessarily invasives like the knotweed. This is, as you can see, white pine and gray birch, red oak are not invasive species, but to this particular habitat, they will take over, and we don't want that to happen. So in April, there was what was now going to be the third prescribed, it was the third prescribed burn that was done on this property since the town has taken it over from the Navy. So it was a good, I think a little more than a third of the property was able to be burned. In the past, of course, lightning strikes, et cetera, you'd have natural fires. We now put those fires out because there are houses nearby, and so that method of taking care of this habitat is gone. Or indigenous peoples probably saw that the blueberries came back really nicely after a burn, started burning also themselves. So this is substituting for natural method. There's another picture of that. I should also put in a plug. Jim from Town TV3 is putting together a series of videos on that burn with interviews of the folks who are doing it. So that'll be on probably the town website and cable TV3 shortly. Really interesting stuff. This is about 3 weeks after the burn. So you can see already the things are springing back. You're getting green on the ground. The trees that you don't want have been killed by the burn. The trees that you do are still living. There's more. The other parcel, town-owned property that the Conservation Commission has been doing work on is the western Sawtooth. You can see in the upper right, there's a sign at the start of the trail system. Again, another popular trail. It's over by that start is over by the two cemeteries that are on the Bath Road, and you access through Pine Street, Chamberlain Ave there. And there's two different things we're doing here. The sandplain grassland on the right there, and as well as there's bittersweet all along that border, that Sawtooth border. And we've been doing things in both those areas. Of course, bittersweet, everybody's familiar with that. I was pulling some out of my own yard today. Didn't look as bad as this, thankfully, but these are on the landowner's side of a trail that goes, there's the start of the trail, goes through the woods there, but right along that Sawtooth border. This is on the other side, this is, if you're going down this trail from the start, property owners are on the right, town property is on the left, so that's what the interior of that looks like. And what we're trying to do here is not tackle that enormous bittersweet growth that's right next to people's backyards, but to make sure that none of it crosses over into the wooded area. So if we see anything in the path, we'll pull that. If we see anything that has crossed over the path and is going into the wooded area, we'll pull that. You can just leave the bittersweet, it won't regrow like knotweed, so there aren't any bags filled, so I don't have quantitative results for this, but we go in there about once a year and do that. On the western sawtooth, we're trying to keep this habitat the way it is. We've been going in and targeting white pine trees that grow quickly and will crowd out the native species. We've done one tree removal since the town got that property. Probably looking at another one within a year. The town arborist goes out and tags all the trees we need to remove. And when we did this, we cut about 700 white pines. So it was a big effort, but trying to keep that property the way it should be. And then just a little bit about choosing a project. We're an all-volunteer group, so you want to do something that's manageable. Steve touched on this already with land trust properties, but you only have so much time. You got to get town support and resources to help out for most of these, like picking up the bags after we fill them. It's got to be pretty easy to coordinate. It's got to be valuable. You want to have good reason ecologically to perform this sort of work. And you really need to have results you can see progress, or else people are obviously going to get a little disappointed, and rounding up the volunteers is going to be more challenging. And then sustainable. You need to keep at it for the most part, so it needs to be something that you can continue to work on. We do it annually for the bittersweet and the knotweed. So just keep those things in mind if you're organizing something similar. Yes?
Well, directly related to that last slide. So when I walk around my neighborhood, I can see the bittersweet, I can see knotweed. I can only do so much on my property, but like I'm itching to like, what's the best way to do that? Is it just talk to the neighbors? Is there any kind of like, I've participated in citizen science things before. Can we do like a training to be like, hey, I've been trained in how to remove this stuff. Would you mind if I went in here?
Yeah, I think talk to neighbors and say, hey, I'd be happy to help out if you need help, or I'll happy to take this on.
Okay.
I can't imagine anyone would be opposed to free yard.
You know,
Yeah.
well, talk about the Lucans.
Yeah.
So we don't go there, but I just didn't know, like, is that allowed to like just kind of do it yourself, or do you need to kind of prove you know what you're doing?
Yeah, well,
As long as it's on your own property.
Well, I already did mine.
yeah.
So I'm like, what's next?
But your neighbors will keep coming over into your yard, so, yeah. And also, if you need to prove that you know what you're doing, the state website that Steve mentions has all the, for each species, the preferred methods for removal, so you can back that up. Yep.
I was wondering kind of the same thing for not like residents, but like businesses or kind of abandoned properties, or like the old Amtrak tracks that are down there. There's a big knotweed stand there. What can be done about that stuff when it's not a neighbor that you can go?
Yeah. If it's town property, you can call Ashley, town's environmental planner. You know, a lot of these same things apply, even if it's a large scale or if it's a town property. It takes a lot of effort to eradicate, particularly knotweed. So, Yes.
So just to add on to what Kurt suggested, so the big thing, whether it's public, private, what have you, it's figuring out who owns the property. So that way you can figure out the proper channels that you have to go through. So something like Amtrak property, that would also be a situation where you could come to me and I could reach out on your behalf to talk to Amtrak about possible removal. But that being said, given that it is private property, that would be something in that capacity would be a little more complex because you get into safety issues. But beyond something what I would consider more of an extreme that might be a little bit more difficult to tackle, it's all about figuring out ownership, talking to who the owners are, and depending on if they're, a local organization that's kind of conservation minded, you might not have a whole lot of opposition, but we are working on educational resources for residents and private property owners that you could bring to them to make your case and see if they'd be amenable to allowing or pursuing removal.
Yes.
Is this just about plants, or can I ask a question about critter? Because they're in Topsom, there's a part of the, I believe it's the power company land, and it's just teeming with brown-tailed moth, caterpillars, and it's right next to the neighborhood where my mother lives, and I don't know, do they have any responsibility to clear that up or do anything to take care of that, or is there any legal recourse to, do you think, I know that I've seen some posters that CMP has put up, for instance, talking about proper plants and native plants to grow by power lines, so I think that they are interested in keeping in ecological sustainability, but it just seems like, I don't know, there should be some responsibility on their part to do something about that.
Yeah, and that one's, that's challenging. Not everybody's going to want spraying around them, but then certainly people are going to have health issues related to that, so I think just calling them and seeing if they were aware of the situation to begin with, and then if they have thought about doing any remediation or any treatment. But fortunately, Conservation Commission hasn't had to deal with brown-tailed moth infestations, so Any others? All right, Sandy's up.
Hello. Good evening, and this will be a little bit of a change of pace. I'm a writer and a storyteller, not a scientist, and so I do research, and I did do some research for this, but I have some stories to tell, or a real story to tell, and a few thoughts. I want to begin by suggesting gently, because it's been used a lot, that we give up the term invasive and simply admit that just as we move all over the place, so do other species, often hitching rides with us. We're all mobile. How we work with and adjust to this mobility seems the good question. As prime movers of much of this movement, we bear responsibility for figuring out how to work with it. It's a little clunky, but I prefer the term introduced species to invasive. Here's why. I think it steers away from military language, which I think spawns a lot of our chemically weaponized responses. And I think we overdo the chemicals and we underdo some of the relationship. Introduce suggests relationship. Even as I cut back and uproot the bittersweet that's been mentioned a number of times in my yard, I also get to know the plant, and I'd rather be in relationship there. So to help me think about tonight, I called my friend and science tutor, John. I have about 6 science tutors because I end up writing about science a lot, but I'm not a scientist. So I called John. He's been teaching environmental science for decades. And he sent me a couple of points that offer a little bit of context for the brief story I want to tell. Here are 2 that made a particular impression on me. The first, I think, is a real attention getter. This is John speaking. The scale of our impact, meaning human impact, is staggering in so many ways. One that really strikes me is that the biomass, literally the total weight of organisms of largish animals, has flipped in the last 12,000 years. 12,000 years ago, humans represented about 1% of the large animal biomass, and other large animals represented about 99%. Now, humans and our livestock represent 99% of the large animal biomass, and everything else, whales, elephant, deer, squirrels, fish, etc., represent 1%. I simply bring that up because it points out our effect, and it also points out, I think, our responsibilities. John's second point is one that a number of you know well, and certainly Steve and Kurt have both alluded to it as well. But he said when ecosystems are compromised, the generalists take over. The vast majority, more than 90% of introduced species, fail in a new environment. So a lot of the stuff that gets transferred in fails. What we call invasives, or introduced species, succeed because they're generalists. They can stand different types of soil, different amounts of water. They eat a variety of foods. They don't depend on specific circumstances to breed. As a good example, kudzu in the south was released first in the south of our country to stop erosion. It grows quickly in nearly any soil. It reproduces easily, climbs other plants, pulls them down. It's almost impossible to eradicate. So local species that are specialized to the ecosystem don't stand up well to that sort of competition, and Steve mentioned that and showed it in a number of ways. So there's no going back to an imagined past. We can't eradicate introduced species. So how do we move forward? I think that as the driver or part of the 99% of the large animal biomass now, a lot of that is up to us, and it's up to us to think about our choices. And each time we do, we should consider as best we can the effect of the choices we're making. So here's one story. I want to tell a story. Steve alluded to it earlier. And it's a story of one such choice. And if you've heard this before, you've heard a little bit, but if you've heard it before, I apologize. But it's a good story, so I'm going to tell it again. Of the three major introduced species in my yard, the one most in my mind now is the hemlock woolly adelgid, or HWA, an aphid that preys upon and kills the eastern hemlock tree if left untreated. HWA first appeared in our area a little more than a decade ago, and it has spread, endangering this key tree in our forests. What to do? Here's the story of one possibility, and Steve alluded to it earlier. It's May 31st in Brunswick at the Crystal Spring Farm Trailhead, near the Settlemyre Community Garden. The call came in at 4:55. They're here, said Director of Conservation Margaret Gerber of the Brunswick Topsom Land Trust. We drove over to meet them. Joined by BTLT board member and photographer John Lichter, we peered into the just opened cardboard box and welcomed 1,000 lady beetles to the Maine woodlands. And I should actually move forward a little bit in this. This is HWA. This is what the hemlock woolly adelgid looks like. This is a fully infested branch. And the lower shot in the right-hand corner there is a branch where the infestation is just beginning. There's a small white dot up in one of the branches. So this is the welcome wagon. It had been a long ride from Tree Savers, the Pennsylvania laboratory where the beetles were raised. "You must be hungry," we said as greeting. We surely hoped so, because very soon these beetles would meet their new home, a nearby eastern hemlock, which bore also the white webby sign of an unwanted border, HWA. Left unchecked, this aphid will sap the hemlock of nutrients, weakening it and eventually killing it. As a recent arrival, it has no native predators. The further hope was and is that these beetles, who eat only HWA, will establish themselves and spread into the forest's other hemlocks. Funded by a grant from the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund, the Land Trust has joined other Maine land trusts in a coordinated effort to rebuff HWA. This year's beetle release took place at Crystal Spring Farm and in the Tarbox Preserve in Topsom. Both locations have fine hemlock forests, and they have HWA. Often, when nearing full height, the eastern hemlock is among forest royalty, dispensing cooling shade and open woodland habitat that supports any number of forest residents, not to mention its human visitors. Hemlocks are among our most beautiful trees. A fully grown hemlock grove often has a meditative calm to it, and I, for one, usually pause in the fine grove that rises from the gully of the brook that passes below the ravine trail at Crystal Spring Farm. Speaking for a 2023 Maine Coast Heritage Trust press release, state entomologist Colleen Turling said, "Hemlock trees are extremely important in riparian areas because they help to regulate the temperature of cool water. Keeping our streams cold is critical for trout, salmon, and a wide variety of native species." Turling went on to offer advice about how we, and you can find this also on the website that Steve and Kurt both pointed to, the Maine government website. Sterling went on to offer advice about how we, the public, can help slow the spread of HWA, as well as some early results and speculative hope that biocontrols, such as the recent beetle release, can blunt and contain the aphid spread. Among Turling's points are knowing that the most active stage for HWA runs from March to July, and we, in our ways of moving, are potential carriers, recognizing the white furry webbing of aphid infection and pruning infected or potentially infected branches and piling them away from the tree can help. Because the aphids crawl to get to their spot, because crawling aphids are also expert, nearly invisible hitchhikers, you can barely see them. Keeping hemlock branches pruned and out of the way of passersby can be really helpful as well. But it seems the most promising strategy, at least the one that I am most attracted to at this point, may be the introduction of such natural controls as our beetle friends. Originally from Japan, where HWA also originated, these woolly bullies eat only HWA. And once established, they're always hungry. We return to the woods at Crystal Spring Farm, a little off trail. The box opens again. Inside are 5 lady beetle starter colonies in plastic containers. Inside each, we can see roughly 100 beetles, the size of a period mark on a page. They're crawling all over the tangle of shavings, their tempone. Gerber removes the aerated container lid, lifts the tangle and the beetles out and clips them to a hemlock branch. The beetles are now free to crawl about their new country. Many of us, of all generations, have active soundtracks attached to our imaginations. As I watch this beetle release, my song mind strayed back to childhood when Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs had a hit song called Woolly Bully. Like many hit songs, it had a fragmented story, but a memory worm for a tagline. Perhaps if you are of a certain generation, you can recall that Hattie told Maddie about a thing she dug. 2 big horns and a woolly jaw. Woolly bully, woolly bully, woolly bully. The hope for our hemlocks is just that the lady beetles will turn out to be woolly bullies, making Hattie and Maddie and me happier for our hemlocks. So I have one last thing. That's a hopeful story. We all need more hope. I asked my friend John for something, and he said, working on all this is about humility and possibility. When someone acknowledges how little scientists know about things like what aspects of ecosystems we need to preserve in order to survive as a species, that person is usually called a doomsayer. But the lack of knowledge applies to doomsaying as well. We know a lot about what we're destroying, and I don't want to downplay that, but I also look at the incredibly positive things that have occurred during my environmental science teaching career, things that almost no expert predicted. Two of the biggest are these: the rapid decline in human population increase, almost entirely due to the education of women who, when educated, don't want quite as many children, and the rapid increase of alternative energy along with its decline in price. The vast majority of people predicting about those situations were dead wrong. And so the doomsayers were off, and that's incredibly hopeful. So, one last thing. I'm not used to doing this. There are the woolly bullies being released into the hemlock forest, so they get clipped. That's the colony. These little black dots here are the beetles. And so they're tiny little beetles going after little aphids. All right, thanks.
Any questions for Sandy really quick?
I have a question. It's not necessarily so Sandy, although you know the answer.
You might.
What's happening to white pines? It's like all the needles. I know it's a fungal, something or other.
Yeah.
Last spring we had all kinds of pine cones, incredible amounts of pine cones, and in the fall, it's going well. But anyway, and now the needles are falling off.
I know it's a fungal disease. I don't know the fungal disease. Certainly the person that I know who looks at those pines and I trust kind of shrugged his shoulders when I said, yeah, there's a fungal disease, and maybe the prolific output of pine cones was partly the trees saying, hey, we got to get more of us out there. But I don't know. Steve and Kurt, I don't know if you know any more about that.
I would suggest reaching out to Gary Fish. He's the state horticulturist. He might have some insight, but if it's a relatively new phenomenon that we're perceiving or seeing happen, I would imagine that someone is researching it, but he would be a good resource to reach out to.
Where is he?
Gary Fish with the State of Maine Department of Agriculture. You should find his contact.
If you forget, just call me at the help desk tomorrow. Yeah, or anyone at the help desk.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Marissa McMahon and I work at a nonprofit called Manomet. If you're not familiar with us, we do a lot of conservation science. Our headquarters is based in Plymouth, Massachusetts, but our fisheries team, of which I'm the senior director of, is based right out of Brunswick, down in Fort Andrus, and most of our fisheries research is focused on the Gulf of Maine, and really specifically Maine. So we have a wide portfolio of things that we're working on, but today I'm going to talk really specifically about the invasive green crab, which has been alluded to a little bit already. So we're moving out of the forest and terrestrial landscape and into the marine landscape. So I just want to start, that's not going to work, there we go, with a little background about the invasion of green crabs. So this is the European green crab, so it is of course native to Europe. So on this map here, that blue area is where green crabs are native. All of the red areas are where they have invaded. Green areas are where they have the potential to invade. This map actually is a little bit outdated. So at this point, green crabs have invaded every continent except Antarctica. They are considered one of the worst invasive species in the world. So you can see the red along the eastern seaboard here. So green crabs invaded the U.S. in 1817. They were first found in Chesapeake Bay. They came here in ship ballast water, which is a pretty common way for marine invasive species to be transported. And they made their way to Maine by the early 1900s. So they've been here for quite some time. The reason that we're more concerned about green crabs sort of now than ever before is because, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we talk about why we're so concerned now, just a few of the sort of negative impacts that this species has. So they're a really voracious predator of our native shellfish species. That picture on the top left is a green crab eating a soft-shell clam. Soft-shell clams in particular are really vulnerable to green crab predation because they have a very fragile shell that doesn't close all the way. So green crabs are primarily responsible for the decline of the soft-shell clam industry in the state of Maine. They also compete with our native species like juvenile lobsters and Jonah crabs. They are a pretty common cause of destruction of coastal habitat like eelgrass. So this is a green crab in an eelgrass bed. They uproot the eelgrass. They burrow into salt marsh and destabilize the salt marsh banks. And then that final last picture over there, you can also kind of see these little pock marks all over the surface of the mudflat. That's a space where a green crab has been present and has been digging into the mud. So, I mean, just the sheer number of little holes that you can see on that mud is an indication of how abundant they are. So lots of really negative impacts. The reason at this point in time we're more concerned than we have been in the past is because they're really thriving in warming waters. So here in the Gulf of Maine, we're experiencing really rapid ocean warming due to climate change. This figure here is shown, let's see if I can work this, maybe. There we go. Oh, I don't know, maybe the battery died. That's okay, it's fine. I can just walk through it. So this is looking at ocean temperature in the Gulf of Maine since 1900. That dashed black trend line is showing the gradual increase in water temperature over the last 100 or so years. Then you can see the green trend line is looking at temperature just since the 1980s, the steepness indicating that it is accelerated warming. And then finally, that red trend line is warming, accelerating to a point where it's really unprecedented in just the last 20 or so years. So we are experiencing, and then beyond is just sort of the projections of warming. It will continue into the future. So we're experiencing really, really rapid warming. That warming is creating an environment where green crabs are thriving. In particular in Maine, our really cold winters used to knock back the population quite a bit, and now we have much warmer winters, and so that's allowing them to really increase in abundance. So of course, all of those negative environmental impacts are sort of exacerbated. Really, mitigation attempts have failed. There's not really any success stories, unfortunately. So that kind of leaves us in a place where we are scratching our heads and trying to figure out what the next steps are. And then finally, we also have this lack of long-term monitoring. So for a species like this, we really need to get a very good handle on their population and sort of how that population functions. And until recently, we haven't necessarily had that because we didn't have any long-term monitoring in place. So, and this is, before I get into monitoring, literally this is an example of the mitigation attempts that have occurred. Literal boatloads of crabs being removed from harbors. And again, no indication that it is actually slowing them down at all or reducing abundance at all. So one of the first things that Manomet did when we started to focus on green crabs was to establish long-term monitoring so we could start to get a handle on the population and understanding this species. So these are 3 of our sites. It doesn't show up all that well on this map, but we have 3 long-term monitoring sites. One's at Sandy Point in Yarmouth, one's in the New Meadows River on the West Bath side, and then one is in Robin Hood Cove in Georgetown. And we're doing an intertidal monitoring protocol here because it's very easy to standardize and replicate. And at this point, we have many different organizations and community groups who have adopted this protocol. So we now have sites up and down the coast of Maine that are collecting data using the same protocol, so we can compare what we're seeing across sites and over time. And then all of this data that we're collecting is open access, so you can go online and find all of it on the Environmental Data Initiative. This is an example of the type of data that is really useful for a lot of people to have who are trying to make decisions about how to mitigate and adapt to these types of invasive species. So we want to make sure that it's easily available and accessible. And this is just an example of some of the data that we've collected. So this is specifically looking at density of green crabs from 2018 to 2023 at our 3 different sites. And so at least 2 of our sites, you can see pretty alarming increases in density. In particular, that New Meadows site, we're starting to see upwards of 8 crabs per meter square on average. A meter square is not that big, and this is right on the intertidal underneath seaweed. So it's a lot of crabs in a small amount of space. And that's the average. Sometimes we see more. Sometimes we see upwards of 25 crabs in a meter squared. So just starting to understand some of these trends is really helpful. We're also collecting information on size, sex, color, molt status, injury rate, a whole host of different data points. And then we also are feeding this information into management. So in particular, management of the clam, softshell clam industry, it's really important to understand where and when these predators are most abundant. So you can, plan when you're going to do your reseeding of the clam flats, that type of work, potentially using predator protection like netting to protect the clams. And then what I'll talk about next, which is fishery development, this data is also feeding into how we're thinking about developing fisheries for this species. So, fishery development, this is sort of like we can't eradicate them. Nothing has worked to try to mitigate this situation. So let's turn to this if you can't beat them, eat them theory, right? Which is definitely something that has been used before with invasive species. There's lots of examples of this. Asian carp, lionfish is a great example. This chef, Philippe Parola, is quite a character. He's from Louisiana, and he has a whole cookbook on how to eat invasive species. And so the idea is, maybe we can try to exert some control or some pressure on the population, but also create an opportunity, a market opportunity, or a new fishery opportunity. So with green crabs, when we were thinking about this, there was a lot of hurdles because they're a really small crab, right? So this is like an average size green crab. Here in the US, we're used to much bigger crabs in our commercial markets. So a green crab doesn't really easily translate to picking crab meat or to, the processing infrastructure that we have in place for lobster or Dungeness crabs, things like that. So we started to look elsewhere, look around the world at other potential examples of what people were doing with green crabs. And it turns out there is a centuries-old fishery for softshell green crab in Italy, in particular in the Venetian lagoon. This is for a species that is a close cousin to green crabs. It's the Mediterranean instead of the European green crab. They are identical if you look at them. Excuse me. So this here is a plate of deep-fried softshell green crab in Venice. This is a hugely lucrative fishery. Fishermen are making upwards of $30 a pound for the softshell crab product. That's a picture on the top right of sort of the fyke nets that they put in the lagoon to catch the crabs, and then 2 Venetian fishermen who are actually sorting through their green crab catch. So, with this information, we decided that we really wanted to see if we could adapt this fishery here in the US with green crabs. This really required a lot of knowledge exchange among fishermen and researchers, and so there was multiple times that we had folks going to Venice, working with these Venetian fishermen, have these Venetian fishermen coming to the US, working with us here. really just understanding how the fishery works, how it operates. And really all of it hinged on being able to recognize when a green crab is about to molt and become soft, because the soft crab is the crab that is the most lucrative product. This is just a picture of the underside of the crab. And what we're looking at is really sort of like the margins of all of those little platelets. There's sort of a shadow that forms. And that's because the new shell is separating underneath from the old shell. The crab, this is just a process that how crustaceans grow. The crab will shed its old shell, has a soft shell underneath that it grows into, and that's how it grows bigger. So I always like to point out here that this crab invaded the US in 1817, and it wasn't until we made contact with these Venetian fishermen that we figured this out, like 6 years ago. So, I mean, however many hundreds of crabs we've looked at and thousands of crabs we've handled, and it wasn't until we had this knowledge exchange that we realized that this was even something that was happening and was something you could recognize. So the next step was to really figure out if we could actually go out and find these crabs in the environment and actually produce soft shells. So that's where it loops back to that monitoring data. Knowing when and where crabs are molting was really important, so we could go out and target them. The males tend to all molt in the spring, the females molt in the late summer. And so we would go out, we would, find these crabs, sort through the catch, figure out which ones we thought were pre-molt, and then we'd hold them in individual cages so we could watch them throughout the rest of their molt cycle. We called these crab condos. And so this was just a way for us to actually judge how good we were getting at doing this. The Venetian fishermen have been doing it for hundreds of years, so they don't really make very many mistakes when they're trying to identify these pre-molt crabs. But over the course of about 18 months, we got pretty good at it. So we were able to 82% of the time correctly identify a crab that was about to molt, put it in a cage, and actually produce a soft shell crab product. So we were pretty happy with this. And this is just a picture of a crab actually molting. So that faded shell is the old shell that it's getting rid of. And then you can see the new shell is really vibrant in color. And so that's the new shell that it'll grow into and grow bigger. Then the next step was to really just understand if this was something that fishermen would be able to do, because that was the whole idea. We're trying to develop a new fishing opportunity. So these are two fishermen we worked with, Jamie Bassett in Massachusetts, Chris Jameson here in Maine. They were going out kind of at a pilot scale, seeing if they could figure out how to do this. They were producing about 100 soft-shell crabs a week, and these crabs were sold directly to local restaurants for $3 a crab. And if you work out how many crabs are in a pound, that translates to roughly $25 to $30 a pound. Compared to, I think lobstermen right now are getting about $4.50 for lobster. So this is a very lucrative product. Then we were working with local restaurants to figure out that side of the equation. What's the demand look like? Are customers going to order this? This dish right here was actually a dish served at Enoteca Athena, right across the street here. And so this dish was sort of like a small plate tapas kind of dish that they put on the menu for $9 per crab. So it was $18 for the dish. So the fishermen were making a really good price off of the product. The restaurant was making a good price off the product. It sold out every time. The customers were really, really very intrigued by seeing this on the menu and, really were ordering it and it was selling out. So the demand was there, the supply was there, although limited at this scale. This was all in 2019. And then the pandemic hit in 2020, and this work really came to sort of a crashing halt because no one was able to really take risks at that time, right? Fishermen weren't really, taking risks and thinking about new fisheries. Restaurants weren't taking a lot of risks for sure. So we kind of really had the wind knocked out of our sails, but things are starting to really pick back up again, and so we're actually seeing many different, in sort of the interim time period between the pandemic starting and now, many different organizations and businesses actually cropping up, focused specifically on green crab fisheries, green crab culinary, creating new culinary markets. This is just a handful of those, some photos as well. There's even a green crab whiskey now. So lots of really creative ideas of how to create culinary products, but ultimately all supporting a fishery and supporting fishermen having new opportunities. And so these are, some of the handful of really interesting things people have done. There's also a green crab dog food, which is pretty cool, called Green Monster. And then this is actually a photo from Wolfneck Farm. So last year, Wolfneck Farm composted 12,000 pounds of green crabs. And they're using it in compost for their strawberry fields, I believe. And they really, really like it. They swear by it. It's apparently something about it is really great for growing things. So lots of really creative ideas of trying to utilize this species and find opportunity, and also support, coastal communities, coastal businesses. So that's sort of where we're at with the green crab research. The last thing that I just wanted to talk about, this is not a green crab, this is a blue crab. So this is some new work that we're doing now. So the Atlantic blue crab is very common in Chesapeake Bay, Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, all south of here. Very rare historically north of Cape Cod. However, we are starting to see more and more of these crabs, and it's not considered an invasive species, it's considered an emerging species or a range-shifting species, right? Because it's just taking advantage of the warming water and moving north. However, it is new to this area, right? So it's a new predator, it has, potential to impact our coastal habitats. So we're really trying to keep an eye on this, and as part of that, we're asking folks in the community if they see a blue crab to report it. So you can find the way to do that on our website or using this QR code. We have a little short survey. It's very similar to iNaturalist, and it's just really specifically focused on blue crabs, where you saw one, when you saw one. They're very distinguishable. They are literally bright blue. They're like the color of the writing over there. And they're quite large, right? So it's not small like a green crab. They're very big, and they're very aggressive. So be careful if you do see one. Don't think that just picking it up is going to be like picking up a normal crab. They're very aggressive. And so this is a community science crowdsourcing effort. And so everything that people submit, again, it's like iNaturalist, you can see it. So again, you can go to our website. This is a QR code that brings you right to this dashboard. So you can see 270 reported blue crabs. And I think this was actually taken off of our website a couple months ago, so it's probably higher now. You can kind of see where people are finding them, lobster traps, scuba diving. You can see sort of trends over time. And you can also look at there's photos, there's, information on the sex of the crab, the size, that sort of thing. We have been actively trapping them in the New Meadows lakes and have trapped and tagged over 75 in the last 18 months, so they're becoming quite abundant in this area. So just a plug, if you're out on the shoreline and you happen to see one, please report it. And just some acknowledgements. Lots of people went into, the effort it took to do this work, and lots of different funders. And happy to take questions. Yeah, I think.
How much of it have you eaten?
Of which one? I've eaten both.
Green crab.
I've eaten a lot of green crabs. We actually, I was lucky enough, I went and stayed with one of the Venetian families for a couple of weeks trying to learn about the fishery, and we stayed in a household where they cooked a lot of them, so I ate them almost every day. And then when we came back here, we also were experimenting a lot, and they're delicious.
So aside from the Venetian fishermen, is there any other natural inhibitor of it in Europe where it was a native?
Because they evolved in that ecosystem, there's more natural predators, things like that. Likely parasites, I would imagine. Oftentimes, when things are transported or have shifted out of their native range, they actually outrace their parasites essentially, and so that could be part of it. But yeah, they're also very abundant there, but just nowhere near like we see here. And actually, interestingly now, we went to Venice in 2018, and since then, blue crabs have invaded in the Mediterranean and in the Venetian lagoon, and the blue crabs are actually now creating a huge problem for the green crab fishery, which is kind of wild.
First, Bennett, yeah, green crab, they're delicious. You caught a soft shell, you throw it in a fry pan, you just brown it, and you just toss it, they're sweet. Anyway, my question was the shadow that you showed on the slot, was it the sort of grayish white margin?
Yeah, let me...
Sorry to make you do that.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so it's like a little white area on the very outside, but then even more specifically that darker area, and then the thicker that darker area gets, the closer they are to molting. So the Venetians are so good that they could look at a crab and tell you like within 24 hours of when it's going to molt. We're not quite that good yet, and so we could tell, within 2 weeks, essentially, of when a crab was about to molt. Yeah.
And you'd hold it in the cup.
Hold it in the cage, yeah.
They do that too.
They do not. They hold them all together. And, part of it is that we were trying to actually understand how good we were at following individuals. Part of it is that we weren't good enough yet to know when they were so close to molting that we could kind of move them. When they molt and they're soft and vulnerable, they will eat each other. They are cannibals, and so there is also keeping them separated was helpful to just not lose product. Yeah.
And then do they sell the dog treats locally?
You can order them online. I've seen them on Amazon, but I have not seen them locally yet. But they are made by a company in Massachusetts, I believe. Yeah.
What's your favorite way you've enjoyed prepared green crab?
I would say probably the deep fried, because you could deep fry anything and it would be delicious. But so some of the other kind of fun things that people have done, this is actually the roe, so the eggs on the far right there, the bright orange, that's actually delicious. It's very much kind of like urchin roe or uni that you would get like at a sushi restaurant. So yeah, lots of different creative ways. The photo on the top there, those little tiny ones, those are not soft shell, they're hard shell green crabs, but they're about this big. So even though they have a hard shell, when you deep fry them, they're still just kind of like a crunchy treat. So we were calling that popcorn crab, which was pretty yummy. The whiskey, not so much. I was not a fan.
So that's a workshop.
Yeah, I think so. It's sold out. That was a little bottle. They were selling it for $65. They completely sold out of the first batch, like overnight.
Who did it? Who made it?
It's Tamworth Distillery in New Hampshire. Yep. Yeah.
How do we encourage this type of experimentation? Like you mentioned, it was only 6 years ago that we found someone else in the world who cooked them like this. Like, how do we? I've heard on the internet that some people try to make tea out of knotweed and things like that. Like, how do we encourage people to eat this instead of maybe livestock?
I don't know that I have a great answer for that, but I would say the thing that I got most excited about with this work was when we would go into like an elementary school and, go into a classroom and talk about eating different things that you're not used to. And then, in one instance, we actually had the kids try to develop their own recipes and had a competition. And at the end, they actually made the recipe and we had like a taste testing, contest. And that to me, I think was really impactful because they're at an age where they're very open to thinking that way and to trying new things and experimenting. Not always. My stepdaughter was not like that and would not try these, but some kids. So I think that was really, in my experience, just one way to kind of, change maybe the mindset. I think part of the problem in a very specifically in sort of the seafood world in this country, we have such a very set mindset of what seafood is, right? We think about lobster and cod, and we have a very limited sort of understanding of what the possibilities are with seafood. And so I think looking to other countries and other, experiences like that is really important because there's tons of stuff out there that we're not eating that we could, and that is very sustainable.
I remember when I was a kid and everyone talked about eating butts in the future.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah.
If you just boil the big ones and give them to people and say they're crabs, they will just assume they're Joshua crabs and eat them like Joshua crabs.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and we've actually found that there are, loads of folks who are really interested in green crabs, and sometimes it's just like being able to access them. Like if you don't live on the coast and you're, in Lewiston or you're in Augusta or somewhere and you just don't have access easily. So I think, going to we've done a few events at festivals and different, places like that where we just give them away for free and people love it.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much to all the presenters and everyone who came out tonight. I will say, and I mentioned this already to our presenters, we do have a number of green crab cookbooks here, as well as bug cookbooks, as well as past bug programming. Yes, I had to sample. So that is, Maine is actually known for bugs as well as other sustainable food sources like seaweed, etc. And you will find all of those cookbooks upstairs. If we are missing something, call me again, because that's also my section. So let me know.
And just to add, I think Tom Seymour wrote, you guys probably have it here, Wild Edible Plants of Maine. He tells you how to prepare knotweed, so that might be a good green crab pairing.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, he has spoken here, and we have him on video as well. So, as well as all of his books, I believe. So, come visit at the help desk, and we can get you to all of those things.
We need to brainstorm for an invasive food festival.
Yes, invasive foods. Well, I want to respect all of your folks' time, too. It is 7:30, but it has been so delightful to have you all here this evening, sharing this knowledge. And again, don't be strangers. I hope to see you at further events. And thank you so much for all that you do.